Okay, so here's the normal situation on the left-hand side of the subdural hematoma picture. On the right-hand side of the subdural hematoma picture, you're going to have bridging veins coming off of this side here that are emptying in, but the bridging vein has ruptured. Okay. Okay. When the bridging vein ruptures, you're going to pull the arachnoid matter away from the dura mater, and you're going to get a big old bleed. Okay, so if you want to extend, where's my colors? If you want to extend your dura mater all the way down, so you got your meningeal dura and your periosteal dura that kind of come with it. But the rupture of the bridging vein is what causes the subdural hematoma. The bridging vein ruptures, all the blood pools. You're literally pulling the arachnoid matter away from the dura mater. You get a big old bleed. Okay, so the difference between subdural hematoma and an epidural hematoma. For the cause of the subdural hematoma, it can be a hit on the head, but that hit on the head has to cause head to go forward and backward. Why would I say that? Why would I want to say that that hit has to go cause a flexion and extension kind of motion on the head? How about these bridging veins? When they come in, they're coming in from here and they're going into the superior sagittal sinus. So you're building, the bridging veins kind of come across and they're like this into the superior sagittal sinus. So if you have this kind of motion, you can rip those veins open. So everybody see that? Does that make sense? So that flexion and extension is going to cause these veins to rip open. Okay, so it can be, so hit on the head that causes, so flexion and extension of head. Okay, it's either that or there's something else that's really common. It's really sad, but it's really common that causes a subdural hematoma, and it's shaken baby syndrome. Has anyone heard of shaken baby syndrome? It's terrible, right? So this is, it's either hit on the head, most commonly shaken baby syndrome. Okay, those are the main causes. And the signs and symptoms, okay, there's going to be no lucid interval, okay? That person can immediately, it's going to be a more immediate response because the bridging veins, as they rupture, it's going to result in a rapid pooling of blood in that space. Okay, so you're going to have, the patient could have a headache, that would be pretty mild, but you're going to have neurological deficits right away. So immediate neurological deficits depending, or a non-responsive coma situation that's immediate. Okay, so there's no lucid interval. As soon as this happens, bam, you're going to see some changes right away. Okay, and this is a large amount of blood that's pooling in that space. So the treatment here, I mean, if there's only a small amount of blood pooling in the space, they could try burr hole drilling, but more commonly is something known as a craniotomy. This is called a skull flap. So what the surgeon does in this case, after viewing on a CT, This looks very different than this does on CT, right? So you're looking at something like this. This is a large amount of blood to evacuate. So what has to happen is they actually go in and they slice open the skin and they cut a section of the skull away. Okay, and that section of the skull is actually stored, put in a bag and frozen to be put on later on. Okay, so the skin is sewn back up, but there's nothing underneath. It's just, there's a hole where the skull used to be, the brain underneath that, and like a layer of skin. In this case, when you have a patient with a craniotomy in the clinic, they wear a special helmet because that's really going to mess things up if they, God forbid, hit their head with no skull in the way, right? So this is where you have to have some precautions in place. So if you have a subdural hematoma, you know you have to be extra careful with that person because it's not just a small burr hole. There's a piece of their brain, the skull is missing, okay? And then after the blood evacuates, clears away, the patient gets better. Later on down the line, the surgeon can actually put that piece of skull back in place. Okay, so that's kind of a major deal. Questions about that? So two different clinical presentations. Epidural hematoma presents with a lucid interval. Subdural hematoma is, bam, you know, you've got all that blood pooling from the cerebral veins. Yes?
Would you look for like the subdural was more like a car crash or whiplash?
You could have, yep, you might expect that presentation because you do that motion. And the person may or may not have hit their head, but you're still going to, just that quick motion might cause that. Any other questions?
How long do they freeze it for?
For as long as it takes. You want that person to be, this is a major, it can be a major brain injury, so they're not quite right. You haven't dealt with patients with neurological injury yet, they can be very unstable. You want to make sure that that person is gone far along. I've seen like 2 or 3 months. How's that?
Before they put it back.
Before they put it back. Yeah. You got to get that person back to where they're going to be safe and everything's going to be okay, and everything's evacuated, the brain is kind of gotten back to its normal shape, all the blood is evacuated. It could be longer. But yeah, it's a big deal. Okay, other questions?
So,
Yeah.
with the person who has craniotomy, would our main goal like kind of be like balance and safety and stuff like that? Would we be doing a lot of like safety stuff?
Okay.
Or decision making?
Yeah, I'd be happy. So, in thinking about, so we don't really, our job as physical therapists is mobility. Okay. We're in charge of their mobility. So when I say neurological deficits, remember when we first day of class we talked about the parts of the brain that did different things? Depending on where the blood is pooled and what has been involved, like what part of the brain was involved in the bleed, that's going to be how the patient presents. So you can have visual deficits, you can have somatosensory deficits, you can have motor deficits. Most often we're going to deal with the motor deficits. As far as dealing with safety, we're going to, if patient who's had a bleed on the right side, their safety is going to be much worse off than a person who's had a bleed on the left side. And you'll learn more about that next year. They're going to be really impulsive, and you've got to keep an eye on them. They're dangerous. Okay. We try to work on the safety, but we're in charge of getting them walking again, and having them sit up by themselves, maybe. Having them be able to transfer, go up and down steps, go home with family, that sort of thing. So that's our job, and that's more of next year's question. We'll get to that for that stuff. Laura?
So with subdural hematoma, is there a more common part of the brain that affects, or is it just depends case by case?
It depends case by case. It can be anywhere from, so the superior sagittal sinus is going to come all the way back from here, just depending on where the blood ruptured. It's not going to be tethered by the sutures of the brain, it's going to be a pool. Yeah, okay.
Which side did you say is worse to have a subdural, right or left?
It's not that it's worse. I guess Alexis asked me a question, and that deals more with next year. Worry about that in neuro rehab, not neuroscience. Okay, we're going to do it. But as far as safety is concerned, if somebody has left hemiparesis, they're dangerous. They're going to be really impulsive. They don't know that they have a problem sometimes. Sometimes they have no awareness of the fact that their left side doesn't move at all.
Okay.
If somebody has a bleed on the left side, they're going to be extra cautious. So that's the difference between left and right hemi presentations. That's nerve rehab. Any other questions? Does that make sense overall? So the difference between the epidural and subdural? We'll get more into clinical presentations definitely next year. Okay, moving on. Now let's look at the subarachnoid versus the intracranial. This is now a hemorrhage, not a hematoma. Okay. So thinking about, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to separate this into two different sides. These are my same frontal sections. I'm going to choose to do the subarachnoid first. So this is a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And then this side's, and this is your skull. And this is going to be your intracranial. And that's going to be your skull. Let's look at the subarachnoid first. And this is going to be what we talked about, I mentioned a little bit, the first day of class when a person has a hemorrhagic stroke. That's what this is. One of those cranial arteries that we talked about before. It's going to have a bleed. So, thinking about our different layers, we have our periosteal layer, tightly adhered to the skull. That's your periosteal dura. And then you have your meningeal dura, with a little invagination. Okay. So, dura looks pretty normal, right? Then you're going to have your subarachnoid matter. I'm sorry, your arachnoid matter. Here's your arachnoid matter, just underneath your dura matter. Goes all the way around. Okay. That's your arachnoid matter, and then underneath your arachnoid matters, we still have our trabeculae that are maintaining that subarachnoid space. So the same thing we've seen so far with everything. Okay, but now we're going to have our, we've talked about the fact that we have our cranial arteries in the subarachnoid space. So it's going to be a cranial artery. Okay. And so the cause, in this case, is going to be a cranial artery rupture or an aneurysm. So what you get is this is your hemorrhagic stroke. Okay, you get the rupture of a cranial artery. Does anyone know what could cause a rupture of a cranial artery? What's the big problem these days that a lot of people have that can cause increased pressure inside your arteries? Anybody? Hypertension? High blood pressure, right? And does anyone know what an aneurysm is? No? Sorry? Yeah, it's a ballooning. So if you can imagine your artery is something like a garden hose. If you ever saw your garden hose have an issue, it kind of first causes a big balloon to happen. So just a big outcropping there, and that would be an aneurysm. That aneurysm could go at any time. Okay, it's just a big pocket that pools there. The most common place for an aneurysm to happen for humans, which is the most common place for a hemorrhagic stroke to happen, is going to be on your anterior communicating artery. Okay, and in this case, this aneurysm has a special name. It's called a berry, B-E-R-R-Y aneurysm. And same berry aneurysm because it looks like there's just a little berry sticking off like a blueberry, but it's red. Raspberry? I don't know. Sticking off the end of the anterior communicating artery. Remember the anterior communicating artery? That's that little one that connects the anterior cerebral arteries, left and right halves of the brain, right in the front. And it's just a little berry there. And that's the most common place for a brain bleed. Okay, so when you have the brain bleed in there, you're going to have patients, depending on where the bleed is. Okay, the signs and symptoms are going to be neurological deficits, and then the big one, a headache. H-E-A-D, I can't spell, H-E-A-D-A-C-H-E. Big headache. Okay, there's going to be a person complains of a headache that's worse than anything they've ever had before. Okay, what happens is that blood is being released inside the subarachnoid space and putting a whole lot of pressure on the brain. There's no place for it to go. Okay, so as that blood is being released, then the pia mater, or the underlying brain, gets seriously compressed. Interestingly enough, and on this side, the pia mater looks pretty normal, right? No reason for it not to. The interesting thing is that when a patient's had a hemorrhagic stroke, they tend to have a much better prognosis than patients with an ischemic stroke. Because once that blood is absorbed by the brain, they do much better. Sometimes there's something called a midline shift. They get spasticity, not so good. Okay, and the treatment for this one is just conservative. That means that even though they realize that there's a bleed somewhere, they're just going to watch it, make sure it doesn't get that much worse, and just let the brain take care of resorbing the blood by itself. So really, they don't do anything. They know it's there. If it's really, really bad, then they might consider doing surgery. But more often than not, somebody with a brain bleed, they're just going to let it go. Okay. The other presentation that might go along with the neurological deficits and a headache is a stiff neck. We'll talk about why that appears when we get to the ventricles here in a minute. But it's stiff neck. Yeah, stiff neck. The stiff neck is just the blood that's in the subarachnoid space. It irritates the meninges. That's one of the signs of a meningitis or meningeal inflammation is a stiff neck. Okay, may or may not. And that's going to be your subarachnoid hemorrhage, just a basic stroke. That's a hemorrhage. Questions about that one? Does that make sense? Okay, and the last one is an intracranial hemorrhage, and that's just like it sounds. I mean, you're going to have a bleed. It's usually a small bleed in the intracranial, in the brain itself. Okay, so it's not in a physical space, but it's actually in the area of the brain. And again, we have your periosseal dura, totally here to the skull. And underneath that, we have your meningeal dura. Then you've got your arachnoid matter. intraveculae. So everything looks normal up here. No changes whatsoever. Then you have your pia mater that's tightly adhered to the surface of the CNS. Okay. The intracranial is just going to be a bleed in the brain itself. Again, it's more of a small amount of blood, and it's going to happen in one of two places. Its cause is a rupture of, if anybody remembers the pontine arteries, remember those small arteries that are coming off the basilar artery that supply the pons with blood? Talked about those the other day. Okay, and it could also be in something called, just so you've heard the word, lenticulostriate. Lenticulostriate arteries. And these are just arteries that come off the MCA. Remember the MCA? And they supply the basal ganglia, or that area that's kind of under the corpus callosum, with blood. We talked about that big empty space being supplied by a bunch of different things. Lenticulostriate off the MCA supplies specifically the basal ganglia. And it's a common place for an intracranial hemorrhage. Okay. Again, it's due to either hypertension, or it could be due to something called an AVM, which stands for arteriovenous malformation. Has anybody ever heard of an AVM before, arteriovenous malformation?
Yeah, my brother's ex-girlfriend.
Okay. Did she have a bleed?
Yeah.
Yeah. So an arteriovenous malformation is where the arteries and the veins, they connect. Their arterial system is connecting to your venous system. There are a bunch of small arteries, and with an arteriovenous malformation, they kind of get tangled up. And that's a common place for a bleed to occur. So it's either hypertension or an AVM. Either one can cause. And as far as treatment is concerned, let's go with signs and symptoms first. Sorry. Let's talk about signs and symptoms. As far as signs and symptoms, you can have a headache, again, anytime you have a buildup of blood, it's going to cause an increase in pressure because the skull is keeping things compact. And then you're going to have something called focal. Focal means in a very specific place, focal neurological deficits. So, for example, if it were a pontine artery, then anything that's in the pons where the rupture happened can be affected. We're going to find out there's a lot of cranial nerve nuclei in the pons. We're going to find out that all the sensory information that comes from the environment up to your brain travels through the pons, and all the motor information that comes from your brain going down to your spinal cord travels through the pons. So wherever the bleed was, whatever happens to be in that area is what you're going to witness in the patient with a small bleed, like an intracranial hemorrhage. And the treatment is conservative. They know it's there. They're going to manage the symptoms and just kind of watch them. Okay, so you may, if you work with patients post-stroke in your future, see somebody with a subarachnoid, probably see a subarachnoid hemorrhage and an intracranial hemorrhage. Subarachnoid's most common of the two. Questions? Okay, that's what we have for the meningeal section. Ooh, that's hard. And then we have, moving on to the ventricles. Okay. Thinking about the ventricles, what I like to do is I like to try and draw them from two different presentations. The first presentation is you're looking at them from the side. So this is nothing more than a sagittal section. This is cerebral cortex, here's your midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord, cerebrum, and cerebellum in the back, right? So just a straight sagittal section here. Got it? So that's where we are. And what we're going to do is, this is going to be a lateral view, and a lateral view to me just means I'm looking at it from the side. Okay, not necessarily from the outside, but just looking at it from the side, and let's see what we see. So, ventricles. I'm going to have, see if I can draw this in 3 dimensions here. So I've got, like to think of the third ventricle as a box. Okay. Just easier for me to visualize if I think about the third ventricle as a box. Okay, so this is going to be your third ventricle. It's kind of a great big overview of the ventricles. All we're doing is looking at the ventricles from the side. And at the end, we're going to connect the ventricles and the meninges together. So we switched over to the ventricles. Ventricles are just big holes that you have inside your brain. And at the end of the semester, when we cut the brains open, you're definitely going to be able to see a lot of your ventricles. Okay, so your third ventricle, we're going to start out with your third ventricle there. And like I said, we're just looking at a lateral view right now. So on the third ventricle, if you could imagine, so I was looking at it like this. So I'm not going to be able to see the left side here, but I'm going to look, there's going to be a hole on this side of the ventricle. Okay, that hole, it's going to be here. So there's going to be another hole that would be on this side, but since we've cut this ventricle in half, we're not going to be able to see it. So there's a hole right there. Okay, that hole is going to be important for connecting to the lateral ventricle. That hole has a name. That's called the foramen of Monro. Monro, M-O-N-R-O-E. There should be an N in here. R-O-E, Monro. Foramen of Monro, M-O-N-R-O-E. Okay, foramen of Monro is nothing more than a hole in the top corner of the third ventricle on one side, and there's one on the other side. We just can't see it because we cut this in half. And connected to the third ventricle is something called your lateral ventricle. So if I'm drawing my lateral ventricle, it looks something like this. It kind of comes up. Okay, just, this is black. Yeah, I'm just drawing them. This is just a lateral ventricle. So this whole thing is going to be, the whole thing that I'm drawing now in black is called your lateral ventricle. Lateral ventricle has a couple of different parts. There's going to be the front part. It's easy to remember. It's your frontal horn. That's your frontal horn. Okay, frontal horn is the front. So coming off the third ventricle, so if you're just looking at this side, so it's coming up and it's going to the front. Okay, and it wraps all the way around and goes all the way to the back, like that. Okay, and the back part is called your posterior horn. Okay, so your frontal horn, posterior horn, and this whole thing is called your lateral ventricle. Everything here. The middle section, the whole middle section of your lateral ventricle is called the body. I'll just say body of lateral ventricle. Okay, so posterior comes off here and then comes back down. And then there's a piece, it's going to go behind the third ventricle. So I'm going to draw it like this. Okay, and this comes up like this. So I'm going to represent it going behind the third ventricle just by having a little dashed line. So that's going to be your inferior horn. So this part that I've represented here as the dashed, it's behind the third ventricle there. That's your inferior horn. Okay. So, yes, Morgan. So it looks like a, yeah, so if you had to, so it would be, this whole thing is contiguous, but it's like, it's just, it doesn't connect to the part of the frontal horn, it doesn't go past the Freeman Monroe. It's like a little finger just poking out. Okay? And what you can see is that the inferior horn is the ventricle that's going to be responsible for supplying the temporal lobe, right? So if you think about the temporal lobe being the front and bottom blood and how that comes around, that's your inferior horn. Okay? Your frontal horn supplies your frontal lobe, and your posterior horn supplies which lobe? Occipital. Yeah, just that easy. Okay, and that's your lateral ventricle. That's going to be the big one. When we actually do cross sections through the brain, we're definitely going to see parts of the lateral ventricle that's available, and I like to look at it from the side because it's got a lot of different parts. And I think from the side, you can really see that the different parts of the lateral ventricle are responsible for supplying different lobes of the brain. Okay, this is just ventricle, and they're just great big old holes in the brain, essentially, and they're filled with CSF. They're also going to be responsible for making CSF. Pat?
You said the inferior horn supplies the lateral or the temporal lobe?
Yeah. Yes. Inferior horn supplies temporal lobe. Realize I'm drawing just one side. The third ventricle, we're going to see that here in a minute from the anterior view, but this is just the left side. So if I'm facing this way, this would be my left side. There's going to be another lateral ventricle on this side. Right? So we've got my third ventricle and then two paralateral ventricles, one on each side. Does everybody see that? See where we are? Okay, and then coming off the bottom, the base of the third ventricle, there's another small hole here. It doesn't have a special name though. It connects up with something you're going to hear me talk about a whole bunch when we get to the midbrain. It's a great landmark here. Does anybody know the part of the ventricular system that goes through the midbrain? Cerebral aqueduct. This here, this is just like a canal connecting the third ventricle through the midbrain. It's called your cerebral aqueduct. Okay, your cerebral aqueduct. Its function in life is just to connect the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. And the fourth ventricle comes off here. It's going to be mostly in the pons. Okay, comes around like that, a little bit in the medulla, and it comes back, and then there's a special connection in the back here. Okay, this is going to be your fourth. This is your fourth ventricle. Okay, your fourth ventricle, it's going to be, let's see, so if you can imagine if the top of my head is the cerebral aqueduct, okay, the fourth ventricle has a foramen that sits in the back. There's only one, and it's in the middle of the fourth ventricle. So if you get the name, I remember, begins with an M. It's called the foramen of Meninges. So this special foramen here at the back of the fourth ventricle, there's only one right in the middle. It's called your foramen of Meninges. Okay, and remember, this is just the sagittal section, so we're only looking at the left half. There's another foramen that you're going to see here, and I'm going to represent it as dashed lines because it's sticking out to the side. So the foramen, if the top of my head is cerebral aqueduct, and I'm the fourth ventricle, foramen Meninges, my foot sticking back in the middle, I have two other foramen, one on each side, okay, represented by my arms. These are the foramen of Luschka. Remember, Luschka for lateral, okay? This is one. This is going to be one foramen of Luschka, L-U-S-C-H-K-A. Foramen of Luschka. Luschka for lateral, Meninges for middle. Okay, we're going to look at an anterior view here in a minute, but for now, we just see that there's one foramen of Luschka and it's on this side. Does everybody see that? See how that happens? So, fourth ventricle has one foramen in the back, foramen of Meninges, and I've got two, but I can't see, I can only see the one that's sitting in the back. So that dash line on the side. Got it, Hannah? No? Yeah, so, yeah, if I'm facing forward and cerebral aqueduct's up here, okay, foramen of Meninges, my foot is back in the middle, I've cut through the middle of that, so I can only see this one. The foramen of Luschka is my hand on this left side.
Okay.
It's pointing back, pointing to the opposite side.
So what are the smaller dots representing?
It's representing that it's going out the other way.
Oh.
Coming toward you would be solid, going away from you would be, I can make it solid if you want to make it more sense. What you see, there's going to be two of them. This is just the one that's on that side. Can't see the other one yet. The other one we're going to see from the anterior view. Right? So two different foramen that we're be worried about in the fourth ventricle. Fourth ventricle occupies most of the pons. Two different foramen of Meninges, foramen of Luschka. Okay, two foramen of Luschka, one foramen of Meninges, and then the rest of this just continues on down the spinal cord. Does anyone know what the continuation down the spinal cord is called? What that hole in the middle of the spinal cord is called? It's called your central canal. That's your central canal. Okay, so overall, there you have it. Your third ventricle, I like to start with the third ventricle, and that's kind of sitting in the middle. Lateral ventricles, two of them are going to come off the third ventricle, and third ventricle is also going to be connected to cerebral aqueduct. That's a connector through the midbrain from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Fourth ventricle occupies most of the pons and has a couple of foramen to think about, as well as it continues on all the way down through the spinal cord. It's called the central canal. Okay, questions? This is one view. Okay, I like this view because you can see the different parts of the lateral horn, and they supply different parts of the brain. So if you move on to the anterior view, missing one. Too much stuff. Do you guys have a third? Or is it just this one? No, we're just going to do it off of this one. Okay, this is going to be the anterior view, and what we're going to do is we're going to connect all the systems together. We're going to connect first the Meninges and then the ventricles all together. Starting off, this is just my standard frontal section, cerebrum, midbrain, pons, medulla, spinal cord. These guys here are a pair of special nuclei that we're going to talk about later on, and that's going to represent, when you see this, it's going to represent a thalamus. So this is one thalamus. supposed to give you a reference point for where we are. Okay. It's going to be an important nuclei for sensory information when we get to later on in the course talk about. Okay. Now, the third ventricle, I drew it as a box before, but this time I'm going to draw it as you see it from the front. Okay. It's got the top portion here. Okay. And it actually exists in between the thalami. Okay. So this is going to be my third ventricle. Okay, that's the top and the sides. And if you remember the third ventricle, on the top of the third ventricle, on the sides, there's two foramen that you need to know about. Does anybody remember what they're called? Foramen of Monroe. Okay, these are the foramen of Monroe. Okay, the foramen of Monroe. Nothing more than where the third ventricle connects with the lateral ventricles. Question? No? See that? Okay, just looking at it from the front now. So the lateral ventricles, from the front, what you see for the lateral ventricles is just going to be this. They're just going to look like a little lateral ventricle. There it is, just a little horn kind of shape. It's going to be on the outside. Okay, so now you're looking at the pair of lateral ventricles. Last picture from the side, we only saw one of them. Okay, but these are your lateral ventricles. You have two of them. You can't really see, you can't really see all their extensions, the frontal, posterior, inferior horn from the anterior view, which is why I like to draw it from the side too. So you see all that with a lateral horn. Got a lot of parts to it. Okay, moving on down, you've got your third ventricle that exists here between the thalami, right? And then connecting up at the base of the third ventricle, no specific name, there's going to be this connector that goes through the midbrain. And the connector that goes through the midbrain is your cerebral aqueduct. I'm going to pull that way out here. Cerebral aqueduct. Anna, do you have a question?
What are you saying that doesn't have a specific name?
The thing that doesn't have it is there's a hole right here at the base of the third ventricle.
Oh, and then like the ladder looking thing itself is this.
That's the cerebral aqueduct, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it does have a name.
So the foramen, every time the ventricles connect somewhere, they give that hole where they connect a name. So like these are the foramen of Monroe, but this doesn't have a name. The foramen, the opening that connects the third ventricle to the cerebral aqueduct, it's a foramen of something. Nobody ever named it.
And the cerebral aqueduct connects the third and fourth ventricles.
The cerebral aqueduct goes through the midbrain, connects the third and the fourth ventricles, and now I think you're going to see the foramen of Luschka here. So then you're going to have your fourth ventricle here. And then, okay, now you're not going to be able to see, so here's your foramen of Luschka. There's two of them, right? We only saw one a little bit ago, but now you can see both of them because they're on the side. S-C-H-K-A. Okay, that's your foramen of Luschka. Now your foramen of Meninges is going to be sticking out the back. So now you're looking at, from the top of my head is the cerebral aqueduct. Foramen of Luschka is out to the side. Foramen of Meninges is going to be sticking back toward the cerebellum. Right, that's my leg in the back. So that's kind of here. So now I'm going to represent this as sticking backward, okay? But that's a foramen, and that foramen is called the foramen of Meninges. Okay, foramen of Luschka, foramen of Meninges, and then continuing on down, this is just the central canal. Inside every ventricle, there's something that makes CSF, okay? And there's some, and we can see them when we look at cross sections of the brain. So every ventricle has a bunch, and I'm just going to represent them like this. Also realize that they're everywhere. Okay. Does anybody know the name of the thing that makes CSF? These are called choroid plexus. So these things here, looking like a little broccoli on a stem, right? They're choroid plexus. And they make CSF. Okay. And the CSF has a couple of functions. So CSF helps to provide buoyancy to the central nervous system. So essentially the central nervous system has the CSF inside of it, through the ventricle system, and also around the outside of it through the subarachnoid space. Right? So it provides buoyancy. It provides protection. So all that fluid floating around provides an extra layer of protection. It's involved in metabolite removal. Okay, and it provides a stable ionic environment. Okay, so those are the basic functions of the CSF. Provide buoyancy, protection, metabolite removal, and a stable ionic environment. So CSF itself has very little protein in it, and it should be acellular. Okay, and looking at, if you had to draw CSF and look at it. Now, connecting everything together. Green, again, this is going to be your pia mater, right? Pia mater is tightly adherent to your CNS. So here as I can get it. So this is your pia mater. First meningeal layer means soft mother. Okay, over top of your pia mater, you're going to have your arachnoid matter with your trabeculae that help maintain that space between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater. Okay, so the trabeculae are there to help maintain that space. And you can see now that those foramen, both the foramen of Meninges and the foramen of Luschka, coming out of the fourth ventricle, are actually there to provide the CSF that's made in the ventricles to that subarachnoid space. So do I see that? So the CSF is made here in the ventricles, but then it drains, really, into the subarachnoid space here through the foramen of Meninges and the foramen of Luschka. Okay, and we've seen also that you have your dura mater. Do it right. So you did your meningeal dura mater, which was here, that made that invagination, right? So here's your meningeal dura. And then around that, you've got your periosteal dura as well. And we talked about the superior sagittal sinus here. We talked about the superior sagittal sinus was important for draining venous blood from circulation as well as the CSF. But it turns out that there are special structures that reside within the subarachnoid space that are involved in draining the CSF from the subarachnoid space into the superior sagittal sinus. And these structures are known as arachnoid villi. Arachnoid, so I'll say villus for one. Arachnoid villus. Okay, so it's going to be the arachnoid villus that helps drain the CSF from the subarachnoid space into the superior sagittal sinus. Okay, so bridging veins help drain venous circulation. Arachnoid villus helps drain CSF. The CSF is made in the ventricles, gets into the subarachnoid space through the foramen magendae and Luschka, and is drained into the superior sagittal sinus by the arachnoid villus. Do you have a question, Laura? Or it drains into the superior sagittal sinus, this structure right here, remember? Okay. Yes? It's draining from the subarachnoid space. So that area under the arachnoid matter that's maintained by the
What's it like? Where are they located? What's the difference between the arachnoid villus and then was it the draining veins?
bridging veins.
Bridging veins.
The bridging veins connect venous circulation, so your venous system, to the superior sagittal sinus. The CSF is drained from the subarachnoid space into the superior sagittal sinus. So two different systems. Arachnoid villus are different than the bridging. Bridging veins are veins.
Okay.
Arachnoid villi are just connectors.
Okay.
Kind of like the same thing if you want to think about it as kind of a connection system, like an overflow system. You know,
Okay.
a small hole that allows this to transport. And that's going to be really important for the outflow of CSF. Does anyone know what the buildup of CSF is called in your ventricles, in your system? You don't have a way to get rid of it. It builds up. It's something called hydrocephalus. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about hydrocephalus in the beginning of next class. I'll show a video of a patient with hydrocephalus. There's a clinical triad that you need to be aware of that deals with hydrocephalus. But if the arachnoid villus gets clogged, actually any clog anywhere along the system can cause problems. Okay. Okay, well, we'll pick up with that next class then.